Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Future of XYZ. We are going to be speaking about the future of augmented reality. Jay Silvas is our guest. Jay, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm happy to be here.
Well, it's really exciting because you have such an interesting background. I mean, you are a Marine Corps vet who was a signals analyst and an intelligence officer. You have a background studying game design. You've been out in Seattle for the better part of a decade as a developer for all sorts of different startup companies. And when I connected with you, or how I connected is, your CEO at Curie spoke at XRC Labs demo day, where I've been a mentor and advisor for the better part of, I don't know, 8 years or something like that. And he was talking about Curie's technology, where you work now as a product manager and
Mhm.
UX designer, of translating 2D objects into 3D specifically for the metaverse, which is super cool. But when you and I started chatting, it was like, well, 3D object design is one aspect really of what is
Yeah.
becoming, we'll just call it augmented reality as a catch-all. Talk to me a little bit about your own journey, but also like what is augmented reality?
Yeah, it's a fascinating space to me for all of the different reasons that you mentioned, whether it's like the video game design background, because it's all experiential design, trying to craft a story for someone to actually go through and have agency and be able to sort of write their own story in, which is very different from a lot of the other mediums. Like if you're trying to create a film or write a book where someone's kind of a passive observer. And then the sort of analytical problem solving, investigation and research background from that whole signals intelligence side of things kind of gives me a little bit of a different lens. So when I came to Seattle and started really getting into the technology space, and starting to dabble a lot more in XR, or AR, augmented reality, and XR being this sort of extended reality catch-all term. We can talk about that.
Yeah, please.
um, yeah, so like that, the interest there was just innate. I already was deeply fascinated with the effect and the power of virtual reality and these sort of immersive technologies. So then you overlay that with sort of the experience I had in the military, and then working in startups, and dealing a lot more with AI since over the past half decade. Past decade almost now, having really blown up as a space. It just creates an interesting intersection. So the fact that we are taking all of this content, this data that exists on the internet now, and people, companies like Amazon are trying to convert it in a way so that it is spatial. It's not just 2D. It doesn't just fit on a laptop screen or a tablet or a phone. It now needs to be able to interact somehow with the real world, which brings all of these different major players into the spatial realm, meaning they need to start dealing with 3D and video game technologies that have been around for decades, like engines like Unity and Unreal. And it also is converging with this immersive reality domain where people are trying to build more immersive experiences, to be able to shop and see different kinds of products, or to be able to have an actual immersive like storytelling type experience. So it's all converging in a very interesting way. And the other element there that really comes into play is all of these different areas where AI, in its many different forms, whether that's nerfs, which I think you may have mentioned earlier, or different kinds of computer vision, that are all being used to create systems that are just more intelligently interpreting that spatial environment.
Which is super interesting. I mean, I think about Tesla as an example, right? Like
Yeah.
Tesla is I won't say, I mean, it's notorious for all sorts of things, as well as very, very proud. But I think one of the things that is really interesting is I think that there's something like 19 or 20 sensors on the car that are
Mhm.
photographing everything in real time in order to enable that, self-driving mechanism that is, to your point, interpreting the outside environment in real
Mhm.
time. And that is its own form of AI. But one thing, and then the data that creates and how that
Yeah.
can be utilized later and everything else has all sorts of ramifications beyond security and everything else. But one of the things that you mentioned earlier that I do want to touch on, Curie is obviously the company who employs you currently,
Mhm.
but this idea of translating 2D objects very simply using AI as well as other kinds of tools,
Yeah.
allows it to convert into 3D, which is, of course, having 3D objects is going to enable us to move away from the computer, right? And
Mhm.
engage with the world through our phones or glasses or whatever it's going to be, some kind of
Right.
tool that layers this 3D but data driven piece
Mhm. It's
onto
like it's a
our real
metadata.
experience,
It's
right?
like a metadata layer for the world, but for the
Yeah.
spatial layer of the world.
So what are some of the applications that we can anticipate like nearest in? I mean, we can get into like the future state, but like nearest in, what are we looking at?
I think a good immediate example that comes to mind is something like Amazon Go. Tesla is also an example of where some of these technologies are being used, and I think in very near term will be, if not already, will be useful for identifying and cataloging different objects and obstacles and things that are in the space around, this sensor array that's just driving down the road. But Amazon Go, I think that's a good example because you're literally talking about a store that is just filled. This building is purpose built to have cameras in every single different angle, looking at shelves, to be able to gather all of this visual data and then process it through these computer vision models to identify and track exactly where each of those objects on the shelf is, all of those different products, so that you can go in there and just tap your phone on the entrance and then go and pick something up. This computer vision system recognizes that that item's been taken off the shelf and how many you grabbed, and then also knows that, like, who you are, because you have a sort of profile of some sort that's attached to your account. So it creates that experience that you're able to go into the store, grab something off the shelf, and leave without having to interact with anybody. But that's really expensive to do because the entire store has to be built for that sort of purpose. So what we're starting to head towards, and this is, I think, one of the upcoming Apple devices, which is probably a phone for next year, is going to have sensors and machine learning models that are built in that actually allow it to recognize objects and map out the environment more easily beyond what like LiDAR does right now. Which means that you can basically have, very soon, you'll be able to have a phone and walk through a store or a space, and that device can actually identify and do what that entire Amazon Go store is doing right now, but from an individual device. And so you can think about use cases where if we have more 3D objects cataloged in the real world, you can start to build up ways to identify what those objects are and attach it back to all of the data or the digital twin that is the pair of that real world thing. And you stop needing to build these entire sort of outside in tracking systems, and you can instead just use all of the devices that are floating around or the cars that are driving around the street.
And satellites that are floating in space as well. I
yeah
mean, right?
You're building like a live stream of the world.
Right. I mean, just this week that we're recording, obviously, we see the Webb telescope sending pictures back from billions of light years ago, and so we're getting data from all sorts of places.
Add to that like deep galaxy clusters. The crazy thing is that spot that they pulled that image from is the size of a grain of sand held at arm's length. So it's like, you can literally just look at a single pinprick of light in the sky that is one star and just move over a little bit and look at a dark spot, and like that's what's actually beyond what's visible. It's insane.
It's incredible. And I think it leads me, actually, I mean, it sounds totally unrelated, but it leads me to what I think is a really important question about what you were just talking about, that the next generation phone or whatever Apple's going to release, because they're talking about this, can actually have more power and in your pocket than, say, the whole Amazon Go test model. So I want to talk about the test model, because augmented reality to me, or extended reality, or experiential, whatever, there are all these different words, 3D storytelling, all of these things that we can talk about. But at the end of the day, we are in such an exponentialization of technology development and adoption phase, and there's so much money in the system as well, let's just be honest about that I think there's a very quick turnover. Like, how do we know? I think that's why augmented reality interests me, because you can't, like, virtual reality, metaverse, like all of that feels to me very like almost pop culturally. Like, whereas
Yeah,
augmented reality feels like the truth of what we're getting to, whether we're testing and learning, but it will be the evolution. It will always stay
right.
in augmented reality.
Right. So this conversation comes up a lot, even just among the XR or like virtual reality enthusiast space, because people often will debate about like, oh, what's going to have more impact, like VR or AR, or what particular technology, and it's hard to say, because in the long term, who knows how far VR really gets us. Like there's a term floating around now that is called full dive, or like a full dive VR experience, is where you're essentially eventually able to just replace all of your external sensory inputs with something digital or something through a neural link, a brain computer interface of some sort. Who knows? But that's
Why we'd
talking.
want that, I don't know, but okay, keep going.
Yeah, that's probably pretty far out by decades at least. Um, but the near term right now, the impact to me seems to be more on the side of augmented reality, purely because it's just a lower barrier to entry. Because everybody's devices already support just minimal experiences of integrating digital objects into the base reality that we all live in. So augmented reality is just the space of expanding those kinds of technologies that sort of augment the real world.
Yep.
So that's where all of this, creating all of this 3D data and creating digital twins of all of these 2D internet-based objects to become part of more of this sort of like spatial metadata layer.
It's incredibly mind-blowing. I mean, I think about, there's this amazing, I used to give pre-COVID this talk on change in calculated risk taking. And I went through like the major disruptors of mankind, starting with fire and, printing press and airplanes.
Ooh.
I mean, you think about what are the major
The
disruptors.
Gutenberg press. Yeah.
Right. And exactly. And you think about the smartphone, which only came on the scene in like 2007 is when it was introduced. And you think about, in the span of 15 years, what's happened. And the image that I found that I thought captured this, and it talks about the data and the tetrabytes that have been created and everything else,
Yep.
right? Is basically, it's like imagine climbing to the top of Everest and being given, handed a jetpack,
Yeah.
you just like keep going straight up. And I think it's like a fabulous little cartoon visual that talks about how quickly the pace of technology is evolving, the capacity for data and everything else. And what you've just said is true, which is like anything that is layered into our 2D reality or our reality will augment. Right. And so there are ways into this. But you talked about nerfs before. We've talked about spatial computing a little bit. Like, what are some of the, less technical ways that we can help people who are watching or listening understand what augmented reality can do for them? I mean, besides being like a cool gimmicky thing.
Yeah. So that's a really good segue, because I was just thinking about one of the sort of examples of evolving forward that often comes to mind, and this technologies like nerfs starting to become more ubiquitous, and the way that it's going to affect normal people. I keep on thinking back to things like Instagram, for instance. People didn't really know if that had a business model or if that was something that could even work at the time. But it turns out it kind of democratized photography for everyone, right? Because we all had these phones, had existing devices that were available, that were easy to use, that all had cameras on them. And somebody then builds an app that makes it so that you can add a shitty filter over your really low res phone camera photos. And so suddenly it made it so that everyone could create art. Yes. And it's not that it completely eliminated photographers. There's like still a need for specialized photography, but it completely disrupted that as an industry where only experts could do that. Yes. And the same thing is coming with 3D capture specifically. So like back to the specific example of the iPhone that is going to be coming out that has Nerf technology built in. You're literally using a camera to capture different perspectives or angles from those different photos, and then using machine learning to actually build a representation of that 3D object just based off of 2D photos. So that camera is able to capture a video feed in real time. So it's really easy for someone to just say that they want to take a photogrammetry capture of this apple. Right now, it's a different method to actually create a photogrammetry capture of this, but nerfs make it a little bit easier to create a sort of like real-time 3D representation of it. And they still seem to be getting a lot of refinement right now, so they're kind of rough. But what it means is that pretty soon we're going to be able to just use phones. Like everybody uses their phone to just take snapshots essentially of 3D objects, not just a picture.
Right.
So
right. That then maps it spatially so that it can
yeah, could be
it
geo anchored. It could be geo anchored. It could be packaged with metadata on like what it's interacting with and what stuff it's around. So like if you're a store owner, for instance, and you want to go and catalog your entire like all of your products, you could go around and take captures of all of the different things in your store.
And upload them to your website in the way that people want to see it now in 360 and everything else.
Yeah, which it's funny because that is actually a big part of where like Curie is trying to solve problems right now, is not just in 2D to 3D generation, because anybody that has spent much time in this space quickly starts to realize that like this is coming. It's getting easier, and pretty soon people will be able to do this incredibly easily just by pointing their phone at things. So it's the 2D to 3D game is a sort of near-term problem. And then it will become easier for at least people to capture rough models of everything that they want to in the world. I think there will still, for a very long time, be a place for like high fidelity, photorealistic, professional quality stuff. But that's actually where companies like Curie are coming in to try and create a service that manages those models, those objects, that has a whole sort of pipeline built around refining those and being able to iterate on them over time. And then also making them available via an API so that you can just take a 3D model and display it on your website as like a store owner that has an entire catalog.
It's totally amazing because I actually, in full disclosure, so I worked with a client which is why I was so fascinated by Curie for a whole bunch of reasons, called Live Surface, which is a plugin for Adobe, and it's mainly for designers, and it's so that you don't have to do mock-ups of everything you do. It's an interface that allows whatever your object is to be rendered just at the click, right? But this is obviously what we're talking about in a very different form, and the technology has evolved so quickly. Can we talk about regulation of this space for a minute? Because it certainly feels to me like it's the wild, wild west. Data privacy and my choice to share my data is already, one could argue, very limited. Where is regulation coming from, and how is it evolving? If you can speak to that a little bit.
I will right up front say that this is not my area of expertise. To just as a huge,
I think that's
big
fair.
old disclaimer there, because we definitely have been, I think us and any other company or any technology company these days should be working with a whole slew of lawyers and regulations experts to figure out how to actually manage in this space, because it is very much the Wild West still. There's new devices and new ways of capturing reality in all of its various types of information or 3D models or pictures or whatever, that are coming out all the time. And I think the thing that is clear is that lawmakers, particularly in the US, are very behind in understanding the implications of what any of those technologies have on society.
I laugh because I always reference when Sheryl Sandberg and Mark Zuckerberg went to Congress, and it was the most embarrassing. It was like they didn't even understand how basic business models work, much less the technology. it was shocking.
Yeah, the business models are not really possible in the past, so it makes sense that they're kind of foreign. But then I don't even think people have a greater grasp what the technology means. Because even the people that are making the technologies don't know all of the implications, right? Like it's most people just like throwing different ideas at the wall, building something, and then seeing how it splashes and the shape that it makes.
Right. Yeah. Which is really but the EU is a little bit more on top of things.
They're definitely ahead of the curve from my impression. They seem to be really ahead of the curve, at least on being very conservative about what they allow companies to collect. And then trying to give people a lot more control over the data that they do allow others or entities to use. So I think we're going to for the near foreseeable future, we're going to be following on that curve to try to catch up, wherever it really matches with our principles in the US.
That's a different topic for a different JJ.
Yeah.
One last question as we think about wrapping up. I mean, I have so many more questions I have to say, but I mean, I'm just going to give you the over under. Like, obviously young people, we look at Gen Z who are digital natives. It's the first generation in the world we've ever had who are digital natives. Most of them born after 1995, which is actually our topic next week, is really talking about, these guys were born with smartphones more or less, or they weren't born with smartphones, but by the time that they came of any consciousness, they've
been connected their whole life, basically.
Right? And so I think about augmented reality and stuff. This isn't coming just for young people, because this isn't an adoption, even though right now it is, and we go back to our test and learn. This is coming for all of us, whether we like it or not. Is that fair? Like, what gets you excited about that, and what scares you about that?
Well, I'm incredible. I mean, I'm generally an optimist. I would like an optimistic realist.
Perhaps. I say I'm an optimistic nihilist, so
that one works too. I can relate to both perspectives, but I mean, I'm incredibly excited about the possibilities. I think, as like with all technologies, there's going to be a lot of unexpected and difficult to grapple with problems, and unforeseen advantages and insights to be gained from all of them. But I'm really excited personally from the perspective of how people are going to use these things to create interesting ways of interacting and experiencing reality. I'm really excited about more experimentation in the sort of spatial game industry. So like Pokemon Go was a good example where a company came in, Niantic, and created something where it's literally, there are things that are geolocated on the map. People go to that spot, and in real life, even though they're on their phone looking at a virtual animal, it's projected through the phone in front of them onto the grass. And there's a bunch of people that are all participating in this huge imaginary or digital rendered event that nobody can see in real life. And then they go and do things like, oh, we're going to set up a store in the same spot that a Starbucks is virtually. And then I mean, I don't know exactly what's going on there, but it seems like at some point every Starbucks ended up with one of these stores. So there's some sort of deal going on there. So they're literally creating real estate.
Partnership.
Yeah, they're literally like creating new ways of doing business by just adding layers to the world. So I'm really interested in seeing how people layer stories and create a more rich reality with augmented reality.
Yeah, I love that. Well, we're going to leave it there. I like ending on an optimistic note. Jay Silvas, thank you so much for joining us on this week's episode of Future of XYZ.
I really appreciate it, Lisa. It's fun.
Super fun. And everyone watching or listening, this is our second to last episode before we go on August break. So make sure that you subscribe wherever you get your favorite podcasts or on YouTube. You can also follow Future of XYZ on Instagram or visit future-of.xyz, and stay tuned for some highlight reels that we're going to be releasing from our first 80 episodes. Jay, you're 79, so congratulations.
Ooh, I made it.
And thank you again, and everyone, will see you next week.